Our first speaker this afternoon, Associate Professor Bernadette Richards, joins us at the University of Adelaide, where her research focuses on the nexus of ethics and the law in the context of medical treatment, specifically the issue of consent to medical treatment. Associate Professor Richards applies her research as chair of the Southern Adelaide Clinical Human Research Ethics Committee, also a member of the AHPRA Embryo Research Licensing Committee. Associate Professor Richards is therefore well credentialed to us this afternoon on the topic of innovation and professionalism, specifically the role of tribunals in regulating behaviour. Please welcome Associate Professor Richards.
Thank you. I kind of sat there this morning and thought, oh, I was going to say that, I was going to say that, and it's okay because I've had similar conversations with other people on the panel this afternoon. However, I'll be saying it differently. So I do apologise for some of the repetition, but really we are all talking about similar themes and just pulling them together in slightly different ways. My presentation was really designed as a very basic presentation, providing an overview of the regulatory regime, because we're really interested in the perception versus reality. We've raised that discussion this morning. So I thought before we actually go into that perception reality gap too much, let's go right back to basics and say what the reality is. So this is a very straightforward, just look at what the actual words of the Act are, what the terms are that are relevant, and what the regime is setting out to do. I'm really therefore looking at considering the goals of tribunals and how that manifests itself, and what the National Act, which of course I'm talking about the National Act which came in 2010, which we've been introduced to today, so I don't need to go into that too much. We heard this morning that complaints, or that complaints can be a somewhat unwieldy process, and I wonder what it is, and I think that's something that can be investigated a little bit further and discussed further. But also a good starting point, why are we even considering this? Well, the reason, and why is there this groundswell of people like Lord Saatchi trying to change the law? And it's because there is this perception that the law is killing patients. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm reasonably confident that it's actually cancer that's killing the patients and not the law. So let's have a look at what the law is actually doing. The National Act, as you know, 2010, it's really quite a hefty piece of legislation, over 200 sections, sets out requirements for registration, facility for reviewing registration, reporting misconduct, those sorts of things. It is an enormous piece of regulatory material. I want to begin, however, with one of the broad statements of the objectives of the Act, which set out the guiding principles of the National Registration and Accreditation Scheme. And I think of interest to everybody here today. It's to enable the continuous development of a flexible, responsive and sustainable Australian health workforce, and to enable innovation in the education of and service delivery by health practitioners. So if the law is killing patients, why is our regulation actually grounded on a principle of innovation? We are actually beginning from a regulatory position of supporting innovation. Maybe we want to insert there the or unsaid word, which is responsible innovation. But it must be, as I said, it must be responsible innovation, and it must be about appropriate provision of healthcare. And that's completely consistent with the common law. As we've discussed this morning, there's the negligence regime, and there's also the professional sanctions regime. So, like all of my law students, I asked Dr. Google to help me with this when I went back to have a think about this, and I thought, what am I going to do? So I went to the AHPRA website and I innovation. Just the word innovation on the AHPRA website. It came up with 923 hits. Innovation is mentioned 923 times somewhere on the AHPRA website. I'm really them all. I followed and found I was going down a rabbit hole, but they didn't give me anything great that I want to report here, but it's definitely in the language, it's in the lexicon. And as far as an overview of the disciplinary actions, now Matthew gave us a really in-depth overview of a particular period of time. This is just straight taken from the annual report from 2015-16. 657,621 health practitioners in 14 professions were registered in Australia during that time. 1.5% were the subject of a notification. There were 10,082 notifications. And a national board can refer a matter to a tribunal for a hearing when the allegations is the most serious unprofessional conduct, except of course here in Queensland where things are a little bit different. So I'll just leave Queensland to one side because I know nothing about it. South Australian, sorry. There were 175 national board matters decided by tribunals during this period. 84.6% resulted in disciplinary action, 10.3% in no further action, and 5.1% were withdrawn and did not proceed. I'm not quite sure exactly what all of can talk about numbers sometimes, so we'll just leave it at that. So I looked through a summary of the tribunal and I did actually read quite a lot of them, just sped read them to try and work out what was there, because one gap that we've been talking about is we actually don't know how many of these investigations are actually about innovation. So what did I find? I found, and believe me, I read a lot, and they got quite repetitive after a while. There were findings of illegal conduct, failure to disclose criminal records, selling of Class A drugs, stealing from patients, providing Nembutal to patients, falsifying patient records, masquerading as a psychologist. Why? Drug trafficking, sexual assault, purchasing heroin by providing false urine samples, counselling of friends and family, and boundary crossing. In some cases, boundary leaping, which, when you're finding things a bit dull, are sometimes the most interesting reading for the day. I did not find anything specifically relating to innovative treatment or untried treatment or anything completely outside of acceptable treatment. There was a few discussions about off-label use, and that's about as close as it got. Now, I didn't read all of them. There's a lot of them, but I couldn't find my innovation hits didn't extend to any of these findings. This is not to say that it could not happen. And in fact, some of the critics of the Saatchi Bill movement in the United Kingdom, they said, well, of course you're not going to be finding any cases about it because doctors are not innovating because they're scared of it. So there's not going to be any action. Now, we all know that's incorrect because we do know that doctors are innovating. We saw some examples of it earlier. Medical treatment is advanced. We're still, people don't die from broken arms anymore. The other issue, I guess, which I can't is the one that was raised this morning, is that often the patients won't know that what's happened to them is as a result of untried medical treatment. I would like to know if there was a change in language. If we said, you're not allowed to use the word innovation anymore, you've got to actually say to patients, we're experimenting. Now, you think that perhaps that's the language used to try and bolster some confidence in patients in certain areas, but I wonder really in your mainstream treatment where they do know that it's not something new, if a doctor actually said, I've not done this before, so I'm just going to experiment on you, what would happen? But if the doctor says, try some innovative treatment, then the patient says, innovative, cool, must be better. So there is that assumption linked to the language, but that's a slightly different discussion to be had. Okay, I did say I was going to talk about the process, so that's what I'd better get back on to be doing. The current regime's been enforced since 2010, very well established therefore. And under the National Act, an appropriate board or tribunal, some of this is going over old ground that was gone over a little bit, may determine the health practitioner acted in a manner that constitutes unsatisfactory professional performance, unprofessional conduct, or professional misconduct. So what does all of that mean? So let's have a look at what the actual wording is. We've seen that before today. We need to consider what is unsatisfactory professional performance, what is unprofessional conduct, what is professional misconduct. It's in escalating levels of badness, I guess. So professional misconduct is defined under the Act to include conduct that is substantially the standard reasonably expected of a registered health practitioner of an equivalent level of training or experience. And that really does match up to the common law professional standard, widely accepted, whatever language you want. It's the same test, just slightly differently. It needs to be inconsistent with the practitioner being a fit and proper person to hold registration of the profession. Unprofessional conduct is broad, improper or unethical conduct in professional practice. And it does also categorise behaviour that requires reference to external elements such as codes of conduct and other regulatory instruments, which I think Cameron's going to talk about a bit, maybe. So to a professional misconduct, there needs to be evidence of a pattern of behaviour. There needs to be more than one instance, and I think we've spoken about that today as well. There has to be a clear link to clinical practice, and that's not incredibly difficult to establish. There was recently a case where an anaesthetist who was involved in a research trial, he was no longer treating any of the patients, but he contacted them in confidentiality, and that was deemed to be unprofessional. He said that it was not linked to his clinical practice. Was signed to the trial as a statistician, not as a clinician, and the tribunal said enough related. So that link to clinical practice can be established in a number of different ways. Professional misconduct, of course, is a serious departure from accepted standards and a finding of unprofessional conduct. That those insightful words came from a case called Hussein. So in other words, one's just worse than the other, but we don't quite know exactly what they are. It's just however, whatever's determined. So I'm going to sort of refer to a particular set of decisions. There was the White series. He was a psychiatrist and he was not a very nice man, but he had a series of decisions against him. He was found to have engaged in unsatisfactory professional performance, unprofessional conduct, and professional misconduct. He was really bad. He did a lot of different things. So it's actually quite an insightful series of cases because it does actually address each of the three levels. And the interesting thing is, though, under this particular decision, or decisions, they said that whilst there are differences in wording, the import is minimal. They said it was inconsequential. So I wonder why there are the three different levels. I guess it's sanctions. From a practical point of view, they talked about the expectation of public and peers. They said they would be ascertained by reference to those in the profession with equivalent training and experience and by the rules, codes, regulations and guidelines of the profession. So it's external evidence of what's appropriate under the circumstances. Once again, I think this shows that it's not too different to your common law professional standard. They talked about, they went to the Oxford Dictionary and the Collins dictionaries to try and work out substantially below. They concluded that to be substantially below the expected standard and therefore to amount to misconduct, the registrant's conduct must be shown to be a high degree below the standards expected of a registrant with equivalent training experience. So there's all these different sort of words, of descriptive words used, but there is nothing really certain about what is substantially below. Again, it's a matter of evidence, and that's really what happens. They went through a very meticulous consideration of what he had and had not done. He did a whole lot of different things. He disclosed his mobile phone number, was sort of the most innocuous, right through to providing inappropriate medical advice, making disparaging comments about professional colleagues, advising her she really needs to improve her social life, so get on a wonderful thing called rsvp.com. He then signed up himself and pursued her in there and engaged in a sexual relationship. Guess which one was the most serious? The interesting thing in this particular decision is he was not deregistered immediately. It was not until the final decision, when he was completely the limitations on his practice, that they said, actually, you really can't be doing this anymore. He was supposed to tell his patients, he was supposed to be supervised, and he just kept ignoring all of those. So finally at the end he was deregistered. But it took a great push. So why? What is this trying to, why am I sort of talking about this? Coming back to what we talked about this morning, it's the actual role of the tribunal. It's to be protective, it's not to be punitive, it's not to be, and by extrapolation, the sorts of things we're talking about here, it's not to control a doctor, it's not to stop them from doing things, it's to protect the patient. That's what the tribunal is there for. The key points to take away from, because I'm going to run out of time, were that they talked about unsatisfactory professional conduct involving being below the standard expected by one's peers. It's measured in professional misconduct is measured in a similar manner, but involves falling substantially below. So you're just below or you're substantially below. And what process? Oh, how did that happen? Ooh, that was a bit frightening. I've gone down to you, Tina. Go there. It's gone strange. That's Wendy, that's me. I'm not touching anything. Right, and I'll go to last view. To that? No. Sorry, I don't even know what happened there. Got a bit carried away with itself. I was talking about what's the process followed by the tribunal. And this was set out here, and I know my time's up, so I'm going to say it very, very fast. They talked about it in this particular decision, and they said that the tribunal is established pursuant to that division, and in conducting an inquiry, the tribunal may conduct these proceedings as it thinks fit. So it's quite a broad mandate. So there's a number of different sorts of facts that can be looked at and evidence that can be looked at. So, and it's not bound to observe the rules of law governing the admission of evidence. So actually bound to all the same rules of evidence that a court of law is bound to. And the final, this is the code, and so my final points really are that challenging behaviour is not an absolute. The tribunal can address the inquiry as it sees fit. It can and will refer to extraneous material. Focus is on the protection of the public, but I think significantly innovation itself is not sufficient for grounds for a challenge. What is sufficient for grounds of a challenge is inappropriate conduct. It's not innovation per se.